You think the event disturbed you. It didn't. Something else did, and you agreed to it before you noticed. A message arrives and your chest tightens. Someone speaks and irritation rises. Plans collapse and frustration follows. The sequence feels obvious: event, then disturbance. But that sequence is already a distortion. The event appears as the cause only because the mind moves too quickly to claim it, attaching judgment before examination, turning appearance into verdict without pause. The problem is not that events affect you. The problem is that you treat them as if they belong to you to manage, control, or correct. They do not. What belongs to you is narrower, quieter, and far more demanding: your judgment about what happened, your assent to the impression it produced, your response once the impression appeared. Disturbance begins when this boundary is ignored. Examine not what happened, but what you added to it. You are not disturbed by the event itself, even though it feels that way. You are disturbed by treating the event as something that belongs to your control, your management, your correction, when in fact it never did. The confusion begins here, quietly, and then spreads into everything that follows. A colleague ignores your message. The fact is simple: no reply. Yet within seconds, something expands around it. You interpret it as disrespect, dismissal, or rejection, and now the disturbance grows, not from the silence itself, but from the ownership you have assigned to it, as if their response were yours to secure, as if their attention were yours to command. That claim is the fracture point, not the silence. Or a plan changes unexpectedly. The meeting is cancelled, the opportunity disappears, the timing shifts beyond your preference. Again, the fact is narrow. But the reaction widens because you treat the outcome as if it were under your authority, as if its stability had been promised to you. It was not. The disturbance begins the moment you behave as though it was. This is the boundary that is repeatedly crossed without notice. What is yours is not the event, not the response of others, not the timing, not the outcome. What is yours is the use you make of the impression when it arrives, the judgment you form, the meaning you assign, the response you permit to follow. That is the full territory of your authority. It is smaller than you prefer, and more demanding than you expect. When this boundary is ignored, effort becomes misdirected. You begin trying to correct what cannot be corrected, to control what cannot be controlled, to secure what was never given to you in the first place. Frustration follows, not because the world resists you, but because you have mistaken its domain for your own. You attempt to manage another person's behavior, and call the failure unfair. You attempt to stabilize outcomes, and call their movement disruption. In both cases, the error is the same: you have stepped beyond your authority and then blamed the world for not obeying. Notice how quickly this happens. The event appears, and almost immediately, you lean into it as if it were yours. There is no pause, no examination, just an unspoken claim: this should be different, this should follow my expectation, this should align with my preference. That claim is rarely spoken, but it governs the entire reaction. And when reality does not comply, disturbance is the result, not because reality is hostile, but because your claim was misplaced. To define the boundary clearly, your judgment is yours. Your assent is yours. Your response is yours. Everything else, other people's actions, outcomes, timing, reputation, reception, belongs outside your authority. They may affect you in appearance, but they do not belong to you in governance. If this distinction remains unclear, every event will continue to feel like a personal disruption. If it becomes clear, something shifts. Not the events, the relation to them. But even with the boundary defined, one question remains unresolved: if the event is not the source, and ownership is misplaced, how does the disturbance actually take hold inside you? The event does not enter you fully formed as disturbance, it arrives only as an impression, incomplete and neutral in authority, yet the mind rarely leaves it there, because almost immediately it adds something: a layer, a claim, a quiet agreement that transforms a simple occurrence into something personal, something loaded, something that now seems to justify a reaction. Consider how fast this shift happens. A look from someone appears. That is all. But within a moment, you have already interpreted it, dismissive, cold, disrespectful, and once that interpretation is accepted, the body follows, tension rises, irritation forms, and now the disturbance feels inseparable from the original glance. Yet the glance did not contain that meaning. You supplied it. More precisely, you agreed to it. Or a result fails to meet expectation. The number is lower, the outcome weaker, the recognition absent. The fact itself is limited. But then comes the addition: this means I am behind, this means I am losing, this should not be happening. The disturbance grows not from the result, but from the agreement with these conclusions, conclusions that were never forced upon you, only accepted without resistance. This is where the boundary from the previous section becomes active, not theoretical. The event stands outside. The impression arrives at the edge. And then, within your authority, something decisive happens: assent. You allow the impression to become a judgment. You permit it to define the situation. And from that point forward, the disturbance is no longer borrowed from the event, it is produced internally, sustained by continued agreement. It is important to see the sequence clearly, because without it, everything collapses into confusion. The event occurs. The impression appears. Then comes interpretation, often automatic, rarely examined. And then assent, the moment where you do not just notice the impression, but endorse it, treat it as valid, allow it to guide your reaction. Once this happens, the process feels irreversible, as if the disturbance were inevitable, but it was not inevitable. It was permitted. This does not mean the first impression can be stopped. It often cannot. The reaction may begin before reflection has time to intervene. But the endorsement of that reaction, the continuation of it, the decision to treat it as justified, that remains within your control, even if it is rarely exercised. Notice how this plays out in ordinary situations. Someone criticizes your work. The words are heard, the tone is registered. That is the impression. But then comes the silent agreement: this is unfair, this is an attack, this diminishes me. Once that agreement is in place, the emotional response solidifies, and the disturbance feels justified. Yet the words themselves did not enforce that conclusion. They presented material. You completed it. Or consider waiting for an answer that does not arrive. The absence is real. But what follows: this is being ignored, this reflects my importance, this should not happen, is constructed internally and then accepted. The disturbance is not in the waiting. It is in the meaning assigned to it and the agreement that seals that meaning into place. Without recognizing assent, the mind remains convinced that events carry disturbance within them, as if they arrive already loaded with significance, already shaped into something harmful or threatening. But events do not carry verdicts. They present appearances. The verdict is supplied afterward, and once supplied, it feels as if it had always been there. This is why the boundary alone is not sufficient. Knowing what is yours and what is not yours explains where you should not extend control, but it does not yet explain how disturbance takes hold within your own domain. That requires seeing the moment where you stop examining and start agreeing, where the impression passes from appearance into belief. And if that moment remains invisible, then even with the correct boundary in mind, the same pattern will repeat, because the mind will continue to accept impressions as truth without interruption, producing disturbance again and again while still insisting that the cause lies outside. So the question shifts. Not what happened. Not even what it seemed to mean at first. But at what point did you agree to that meaning, and what would it require to interrupt that agreement before it becomes fixed? Understanding that you agree to impressions is not the same as being able to stop doing it, because agreement has already become a habit, something that happens quickly, quietly, and without resistance, which is why discipline, in this context, cannot mean force or suppression, but must mean training the moment where assent occurs so that it is no longer automatic. You do not become free by eliminating impressions. They will continue to arrive. You become more stable by changing what happens after they arrive, by interrupting the reflex that turns appearance into belief, and this interruption is not achieved through intensity, but through repetition, through small acts of noticing and withholding agreement before it hardens. For example, when irritation rises after someone speaks in a way you dislike, the first movement may already be in motion, the body reacting, the mind forming a conclusion, but discipline begins at the next step, where instead of continuing forward without examination, you pause long enough to recognize what is happening. An impression has appeared, and it is asking for your agreement. That pause is not dramatic. It is brief. But it is decisive. Or when an outcome disappoints you, and the familiar interpretation starts to take shape, this is failure, this sets me back, this should not have happened. Discipline is not the attempt to erase that reaction, but the refusal to finalize it, to treat it as incomplete rather than true, to hold it without endorsing it immediately, allowing space between appearance and judgment. This is why discipline must be practiced before pressure, not invented during it. If you only attempt to examine impressions when they are already strong, already reinforced by emotion, already repeated, you will find yourself carried by them rather than governing them, because the habit of agreement will already be stronger than your attempt to interrupt it. Training happens in smaller moments. In ordinary ones. When nothing significant is at stake. You notice a minor irritation and choose not to immediately agree with it. You experience a delay and resist turning it into a complaint. You hear a tone and avoid assigning intention too quickly. These are not insignificant acts. They are the formation of a different pattern, one where assent is no longer automatic. What matters is not the intensity of your effort, but its consistency. Discipline here is not about becoming rigid or unresponsive. It is about becoming selective in what you accept as true, refusing to grant authority to every impression that appears simply because it appears, and instead requiring examination before agreement. This also means accepting that you will fail repeatedly. You will still agree too quickly. You will still treat impressions as facts. You will still feel disturbance arise before you can interrupt it. But discipline is not measured by the absence of these moments. It is measured by how often you return to correction afterward, how often you revisit the impression and withdraw the agreement you gave too easily. Over time, something changes. Not the events. Not even the impressions. But the speed and certainty with which you accept them. The gap between appearance and assent widens. And within that gap, something becomes possible that was not possible before: choice. And once that space exists, even briefly, the entire structure of disturbance begins to loosen, because what once felt immediate and unavoidable now reveals itself as something that required your participation to continue. If discipline is real, it must appear in what you do when nothing significant seems to be happening, because that is where the habit of assent is either reinforced or quietly weakened, and without this daily correction, the moment of pressure will always find you unprepared, already inclined to agree before you even notice that agreement is taking place. When a minor inconvenience appears, someone interrupts you, a delay extends longer than expected, a plan shifts slightly, the usual movement is immediate, irritation forms, interpretation follows, and assent is given without pause, but this is precisely where practice begins, not by suppressing the reaction, but by inserting a deliberate interruption between what appears and what is accepted. When the interruption is applied, even briefly, something changes in structure, not in feeling at first, but in direction, because instead of continuing the automatic sequence, you introduce a different response. You name the appearance without submitting to it, you recognize that this is an impression, not yet a judgment, and in doing so, you delay the moment where agreement would normally solidify. For example, when you are kept waiting, the familiar thought begins to form: this is wasting my time, this should not be happening, but instead of completing that thought into a conclusion, you hold it at the level of appearance, allowing it to exist without endorsing it, and in that small refusal, the disturbance loses its momentum, not because the situation improved, but because the internal process did not complete. Or when someone speaks in a way that suggests disrespect, the immediate interpretation is ready: this is intentional, this reflects their view of me, but practice interrupts this by returning attention to what is actually present. Words were spoken, a tone was perceived, and beyond that, everything else is being constructed, and that construction does not need to be accepted without examination. This is not a single act. It is a repeated structure. When X happens, you do not move directly to judgment, you pause, you identify the impression, you delay assent, even if only for a moment. When irritation appears, you do not extend it into justification, you hold it as incomplete. When expectation is disrupted, you do not convert it immediately into complaint, you separate the event from the meaning being added. The simplicity of this makes it easy to ignore, but its repetition is what changes the pattern. Each time you interrupt the sequence, even imperfectly, you weaken the assumption that impressions must be followed, that reactions must be completed, that disturbance is inevitable once something appears. There is also a second part to this practice, one that occurs after the moment has passed, because not every interruption will succeed, and many impressions will still receive your agreement before you notice, but even then, the process is not finished, because you can return to it, examine what happened, and withdraw the endorsement that was given too quickly. At the end of the day, you can revisit a moment of disturbance and see it more clearly. The event occurred, the impression formed, the interpretation followed, and assent was given without pause. This review is not for criticism. It is for correction. You identify where the agreement happened, and in doing so, you prepare to see it earlier the next time. This creates a different relation to your own reactions. They are no longer final. They are no longer unquestioned. They become visible as processes that can be interrupted, examined, and adjusted, not perfectly, but repeatedly. Over time, this daily application produces a shift that is subtle but decisive. The mind becomes less eager to complete impressions, less willing to convert appearances into fixed judgments, and more capable of holding uncertainty without immediately resolving it into disturbance. And from this, a different kind of steadiness begins to form, not because events become easier, but because your participation in turning them into disturbance becomes less automatic, more deliberate, and increasingly within your control. What changes through this practice is not the nature of events, nor the disappearance of impressions, but the position you occupy in relation to them, because where there was once immediate submission, there begins to be distance, and within that distance, a form of stability appears that does not depend on circumstances remaining favorable. Events continue to arrive without warning. People continue to act according to their own judgment. Outcomes continue to shift beyond your preference. None of this is altered. But what is altered is the speed and certainty with which you convert these movements into personal disturbance, because the habit of immediate agreement has been weakened, and in its place, a different posture has formed, one that does not rush to claim what was never yours. Consider a situation that would have previously unsettled you. A decision goes against you, recognition is given elsewhere, a plan you relied on dissolves. The impressions still arise, the initial reaction may still appear, but something interrupts its completion. The thought begins, but it does not fully settle. The judgment starts to form, but it is not immediately accepted. And in that partial state, the disturbance cannot fully stabilize, because it has not received the agreement it requires. This does not produce indifference. You still perceive, still prefer, still act. But you no longer treat every outcome as a reflection of something that must be secured or corrected by you, and as a result, your responses begin to align more closely with what is actually within your authority rather than what only appears to be. In practical terms, this means you stop negotiating with events that do not belong to you. You do not attempt to force another person's behavior into alignment with your expectation. You do not treat uncertain outcomes as personal failures in advance. You do not convert every delay into a judgment about injustice. These movements still present themselves as options, but they are no longer accepted automatically. And because of this, something often misunderstood begins to take shape: freedom. Not freedom as comfort, not freedom as ease, but freedom as reduced dependence on externals for your internal state. The fewer impressions you accept without examination, the less control those impressions exert over your responses, and the less your condition is dictated by circumstances that were never under your governance. This freedom is not complete, and it is not permanent. It requires maintenance. The habit of assent does not disappear, it weakens, and if neglected, it returns. There will still be moments where you agree too quickly, where disturbance forms before you can intervene, where the boundary is crossed without awareness. But these moments no longer define the whole structure. They become instances within it, subject to review, subject to correction. What remains constant is the responsibility. You cannot prevent impressions from appearing, and you cannot control the events that generate them, but you retain authority over whether those impressions become judgments, whether those judgments are endorsed, and whether the resulting disturbance is allowed to continue. This is the form of sovereignty available to you. It is narrow. It does not extend into outcomes or other people. But within its limits, it is exact. And when it is exercised consistently, the relationship between events and disturbance begins to change, not because events lose their force, but because your agreement with them is no longer given freely. Events do not arrive carrying disturbance. They arrive as occurrences, limited, external, and indifferent to your internal state. What transforms them is not their nature, but your participation, specifically, the moment you treat what is outside your control as if it were yours to secure, correct, or resist, and then agree with the meaning that follows from that mistake. You see it clearly now. The event happens. The impression forms. Then something within you completes it, turning appearance into judgment, judgment into assent, and assent into disturbance. At no point did the event force this progression. It presented material. You endorsed it. This is where responsibility remains, and it does not expand beyond this point. You are not responsible for what happens. You are not responsible for how others act, how outcomes unfold, or how circumstances shift. But you are responsible for the use you make of what appears to you, for whether you examine or accept, for whether you interrupt or continue, for whether you allow impressions to govern or require them to justify themselves before agreement is given. If this responsibility is neglected, disturbance will continue to seem inevitable, attached to events as if they carried it. If it is exercised, even imperfectly, the connection begins to break, and what once felt imposed begins to reveal itself as something that required your participation to persist. The event is not yours. The impression is not yet a command. The judgment is optional. The assent is yours. Return to what is yours to govern.